Do you not yet have faith? This question that Jesus puts to his disciples was a question that really pierced me to the heart when I read this gospel to prepare for this homily this week. I look at my own life, and in my life, I was baptized 6 weeks after I was born. I received all of my sacraments at the normal times, and I was ordained a priest. And yet, this question is posed even to me, do you not yet have faith? I think it's a question that each of us have to deal with. Each of us have to ask ourselves, do you not yet have faith? Do I have faith? Do I put my trust in God? Do I put my trust in my own power? Do I put my trust in something else? We know that in Scripture, the sea often symbolizes evil or chaos that threatens God's people and challenges God's sovereignty over the cosmos. The sea, which is completely uncontrollable, that looks like it's just complete chaos, seems to be at odds with all of who God is. And we can even see how this plays out in our first reading today, a reading from the book of Job. If you've ever read the book of Job, it's a very interesting book. The book of Job begins with a conversation between God and the devil. In this conversation, God says to the devil, "Look at my servant Job and see how righteous he is." And the devil responds to God by saying, "Yes, but you've given him everything. There are no challenges in his life." And so God says, "Okay, then I give him over to you. Just don't kill him." Job had much wealth. He had many children. He had a loving wife. He was comfortable. So the devil takes away his land, takes away his animals, kills his children. He doesn't kill them, but he causes them to die. And even to Job himself, he begins to get these lesions on his body that are extremely painful. And after all of this takes place, Job's wife looks at him and says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" And yet, even with these, Job remains faithful. Some of Job's friends come to have conversations with him, not really to console him, but they came to ask, "What have you done that all of this is taking place? What have you done? What is going on in your relationship with God that all of this is taking place?" And Job says, "Well, I've done nothing. I've been completely faithful to God." And finally, we get to the end of the book, and in chapter 38, from which we are reading today, it is God's response to all of this suffering. It is God's response to Job and Job's questioning. Are you really God? Do you really have control? All of this chaos in my life, what is going on? And I think it's a question that all of us ask in our own lives when our lives seem to be completely crazy at times, when all of these things begin to happen in our lives. I think many of us ask that question. And God says to Job, not in our reading today, a few verses before this, God says to him, "Were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I set everything in motion?" And we get to our passage today, "Who shut within doors the sea when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling bands? When I set limits for it and fastened the bar of its door?" God is saying, who actually made the sea? Who controls the sea? Who is greater than the sea itself? God is. And Job realizes all of this, And in realizing this, he humbles himself and he worships God. When I was a seminarian, I think it was in my first year as a seminarian, everything was provided for me. But there began to be this stirring in my heart, kind of this uncomfortability. And one day I kind of just had enough. When you're living with 24 other men coming from all different parts of the country, you begin to rub against each other enough, and things begin to happen where you kind of want to get in fights. Nobody got in fights. But you begin to have disagreements about how things should be. And it can often be very hard living with these people with different personalities. And one night I was fed up. I had had enough. I was ready to walk out, pack my stuff, and go home. But I just went for a walk. The seminary in Denver sits on about 80 acres. There's a neighborhood just to the south of the seminary, and you can walk all the way around it. It's a very pleasant and peaceful walk. And to get to the sidewalk to walk around the entire property, it's probably a couple hundred yards from the door where you exit the seminary in order to get to that sidewalk. And I was fuming, kind of just angry with where I was, angry with God that I was here, questioning, is this the way it's going to be? Is this where you really want me, God? I walked out of the seminary doors, and before I even got to the sidewalk to walk around the entire property, there was just this peace that began to settle in. There was this quiet, in a sense, that began to rest in my heart. In many ways, I can see it play out as it does in our gospel today. In the gospel, we have the disciples and Jesus who are in the boat, who are crossing the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is about 7 or 8 miles wide and about 13 miles long. And the storms just randomly come up on the Sea of Galilee, the way that the wind and the way that the atmosphere is. The storms just kind of come up out of nowhere many times. And the sea's waves begin to be large very quickly. And we see the disciples here struggling. Remember, the Israelites, the Jews, were not necessarily seafaring people. They were not ocean. They did not build ships and sail to other countries. The only seas that they were on were to go fishing. And so these were small boats that they were in compared to a big ship. They were comfortable on the water. Many of them were fishermen, so they knew the water, but they weren't crossing oceans. And so the sea was out of their control. They no longer could control it. There's a beautiful painting by Rembrandt that kind of depicts this scene. If you look at that picture, you see some of the men trying to bring the sails down so that the wind doesn't rip the sails. You see some people on the front of the boat trying to row a little bit. You even see one guy with his head over the water, over the side of the boat, not really sure what he's doing, probably puking, he probably got sick. Some of them are just kind of looking at Jesus like, where are you? What are you doing? And I even began to ask the question when I realized this, how long had they been struggling before they even woke Jesus up? And this is how it was for me in the seminary. I'd been struggling for a while before I actually turned to Jesus to give my problems to him, which were very small problems in reality. And so it's the same thing. How long were the disciples struggling before they actually turned to Jesus and say, will you help us? They were trying to control and manipulate the boat to the best of their abilities. They were trying to do things on their own. How many of us do the same thing? Try and control everything and make things the way that we want them, and not the way that God wants them. We see in our responsorial psalm today, it says, they who sail the sea in ships, trading on the deep waters, these saw the works of the Lord and his wonders in the abyss. His command raised up a storm wind, which tossed its waves on high. They mounted up to heaven, they sank to the depths, their hearts melted away in their plight. we also know that in the story of the pagans, they often had gods of the sea, gods of the storms, God of the sun, gods of many different things. And so what Jesus does in our gospel today is he shows the Jews, he shows his disciples in the boat who is Lord of the sea, who is Lord of the storms, causing it to be still and causing it to be quiet. To show them that God brings order to chaos. God overcomes evil, which is the way in which they often saw the sea as chaos or evil. In the pagan sense, we see how the Greeks and the Romans would have seen this as there is someone more powerful than their own gods. And it is Jesus. It is the God of the Jews, the Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The most holy Trinity is the power beyond all powers. And that plays out in their own life. So how often in the storms of our own life do we let them go on before we turn to God? St. Augustine kind of has a good answer for this. He says in his sermon on this gospel passage, I want to urge you not to let the faith sleep in your hearts against the storms and waves of this world. After all, it can scarcely be true that Christ the Lord had power over death and did not have power over sleep, and that sleep possibly overtook the Almighty against his will as he was out sailing. Basically, what St. Augustine is saying, Jesus, who has power over the death, who is raised from the dead, also had power over the storms. He knew that the storm was coming, and yet he slept in order to prove a point to his disciples. St. Augustine continues, we are all of us temples of God, and every one of us is sailing a boat in his heart. You have heard an insult. It's a high wind. You've got angry. It's a wave. So as the wind blows and the waves break, the boat is in peril, your heart is in peril, your heart is tossed about. When you hear the insult, you are eager to avenge it. You do avenge it. And by giving way to someone's evil, you suffer shipwreck. And what is that? Because Christ is asleep in you. What does it mean that Christ is asleep in you? That you have forgotten Christ. So wake up. Remember Christ. Let Christ stay awake in you. Think about him. In the storms of our life, we often let Christ sleep within us. Even when things are going well, we often let Christ sleep within us, and we don't turn to him in our life, and we don't give him all of our life. So I urge you to think about this week. Do you not yet have faith? The question posed to the disciples in our gospel today. And the disciples' response is, who then is this whom even wind and sea obey? They begin to recognize who the divine authority is over all things, that it is Christ himself. Jesus is asking them, do you have faith in me? You obviously don't if you don't know that I have authority over all of these things. Do we know that authority of Christ in our own life? And do we turn to him in the stillness, but also in the storms, and allow his authority to reign over us?